Forward, the story that follows is a work of fiction, but it is set against the backdrop of a pivotal and painful chapter in North American history, the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in the late 19th century was a monumental feat of engineering, a steel ribbon that would bind a new nation together. It was hailed as the triumph of progress, a symbol of manifest destiny that would open the vast, untamed prairies to settlement and commerce. But this progress came at a profound cost. For the indigenous peoples of the plains, the Cree, the Métis, the Blackfoot, and others, the railway was not a symbol of unity, but an iron serpent that devoured their way of life. It brought with it the surveyors who carved up their ancestral lands, the settlers who plowed the sacred earth, and the hunters who decimated the buffalo herds, the foundation of their economy and culture. The railway was the engine of their displacement and starvation. This tension culminated in the North-West Rebellion of 1885, a brief, brutal conflict that pitted the desperate Cree and Métis forces against the might of the Canadian state, a might that was brought to bear with astonishing speed and efficiency by the very railway the rebels sought to fight. It was a war of two worlds, one of ancient traditions, sacred circles, and a deep, spiritual connection to the land, and another of straight lines, cold iron, and a relentless belief in the righteousness of its own expansion. The Scout is an attempt to explore this collision of worlds through the eyes of a fictional character, Kiskisik, a Cree man caught between them. It is a story about choices, consequences, and the enduring question of what is lost when progress is pursued at any cost. While Kiskisik is not a real historical figure, his struggle represents the very real and tragic dilemma faced by countless individuals during this transformative era. It is a story of the land itself, and of the memory it holds long after the echoes of the guns have faded. Chapter 1, The Hunger the Wind Was a Liar. It blew from the west, as it always had, carrying the scent of sweetgrass and distant rain, promising a sky fat with clouds and herds that stretched to the horizon. But the promise was hollow. Kiskisik, whose name meant he who remembers, tasted only dust on his tongue. The sky was a vast, empty blue, and the great sea of grass rippled with a terrible emptiness. There were no buffalo. He lay on a low rise, the sun cured grass crisp against his cheek, his body a seamless line against the earth. For 3 days he had lain here, watching, listening, praying. He was a scout, his eyes trained to see the flicker of a tail or the dust of a distant herd where others saw only waving grass. His father and his father's father had been able to read the land like a story of abundance written in hoofprints and wallows. But the pages of that story were being torn out, one by one. The silence was the worst part. It was a hungry silence, a stillness that spoke of a world out of balance. The ground no longer trembled with the thunder of a million hooves. The air no longer carried the grunts and bellows that were the lifeblood of his people, the Cree. There was only the whisper of the lying wind and the gnawing in his own belly, a feeling that was now a constant companion to everyone in his camp. He pushed himself up, his movements fluid and economical. He was young, his body lean and hard from a life lived on the plains, but he felt ancient. The weight of his people's hunger rested on his shoulders. He was the best of the remaining scouts, the one who could still find the lone bull, the small, hidden herd that had somehow escaped the relentless slaughter from the east. But even his skills were failing. The Iron Serpent, the railway the white men were building, had brought with it an insatiable appetite. It devoured the land and its passengers with their powerful rifles that could kill from a distance a man. Could barely see, devoured the buffalo. He turned his gaze north. A thin, unnatural line of smoke smudged the horizon. It was not the smoke of a Cree campfire. It was the smoke of the surveyors, the men who walked ahead of the Iron Serpent, driving stakes into the heart of the earth, marking the path of its destruction. They were the vanguard of the New World, and their presence was a constant, bitter reminder of the world that was vanishing. It was to them he was walking. The decision had been a stone in his gut for weeks, a source of shame and a desperate, flickering hope. His own father, a man who had signed Treaty 6 and believed in the promises of the crown, had argued against it. To work for them is to guide the arrow to our own heart, he had said, his voice weak with hunger but strong with conviction. But Kiskisik had seen the faces in the camp. He had seen the hollow eyes of the children, the despair in the faces of the mothers. He had seen the elders, their stories and wisdom fading with their strength. Conviction was not food. Honor would not fill a starving belly. The money the surveyors offered, a fortune by the standards of his people, could buy flour and bacon from the trading posts that now dotted the prairie. It could mean survival. He began the long walk toward the smoke, his moccasins leaving faint prints in the dust. He carried his rifle, but his hunting pouch was empty. He was no longer hunting for his people. He was hunting for a different kind of prey, a different kind of survival. He was a scout, a guide. He would sell his knowledge of the land to the very people who were destroying it. The thought was a bitter poison, but the alternative was the slow, silent death of starvation. He hardened his heart, the way a hide is hardened in the smoke. He would do what he had to do. He would become a bridge between two worlds, even if it meant being torn apart in the process. As he drew closer to the surveyors' camp, the sounds of their world grew louder, the clang of a hammer, the unfamiliar cadence of their language, the braying of a mule. The camp was a messy, temporary scar on the landscape, a jumble of white canvas tents and wagons. A group of men looked up as he approached, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. One of them, a young man with a sunburnt face and hair the color of dried grass, stepped forward. He was not as large as the others, and he held a strange instrument of brass and glass, not a rifle. "Can we help you?" the young man asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. He spoke Cree, but it was the stilted, formal Cree of the missionaries learned from a book. "I am Kiskisik," he said, his own voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil in his heart. "I have heard you are looking for a guide, someone who knows this land. I am that man." The young surveyor's eyes widened in surprise, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "My name is Thomas." "Thomas Cartwright, and yes," he said, his gaze sweeping over the vast, empty prairie around them, "we could certainly use a guide." Kiskisik met the young man's gaze. In his eyes he did not see the malice or the greed he had expected. He saw only a kind of earnest, naive curiosity, the look of a man who saw the land not as a home, but as a puzzle to be solved. It was a look that was perhaps even more dangerous. This man was not an enemy who came with a sword. He was an instrument of change who did not even understand the destruction he was causing. And Kiskisik, for a handful of silver and a bag of flour, was about to become his guide. The stone in his gut grew heavier. He had reached the camp. He had made his choice. The first step on a long and dangerous path had been taken. The camp was a world of straight lines and sharp angles, so different from the flowing, circular life of his own people. The tents were staked in rigid rows, the supplies stacked in neat, square piles. It was the world of men who believed the earth could be measured, divided, and owned. Thomas Cartwright led him to a larger tent, where a man with a gray beard and cold eyes sat at a table covered in maps. This was Mr. Harrison, the chief surveyor. Harrison's Cree was blunt and functional, the language of a man who gave orders. He questioned Kiskisik about his knowledge of the river crossings, the low passes, the places where the ground was soft and would swallow their heavy wagons. Kiskisik answered truthfully, his voice a monotone, his face a mask. He could feel Harrison's eyes assessing him, not as a man, but as a tool to be used, and when it was no longer useful, discarded. "He knows the land," Harrison said to Thomas in English, as if Kiskisik were not there. "Hire him, $2 a day, plus rations for his family, not a penny more, and watch him. I don't trust any of them." The bargain was struck. Kiskisik was given a portion of flour and salted pork, a down payment on his betrayal. He accepted it without a word, the coarse canvas of the sacks a brand against his skin. As he was preparing to leave, to take the food back to his hungry family before returning, Thomas approached him, his expression open and friendly. "I'm glad you're with us," Thomas said, his book, learned Cree earnest and clumsy. "This is a great adventure, isn't it? Building a road of iron across a continent. To unite a nation, its history in the making. Kiskisik looked at the young surveyor, at his bright, hopeful eyes, and felt a profound weariness. Adventure, history, these were the words of the men who wrote the stories, not the men whose stories were being erased. For Thomas, this was a grand narrative of progress. For Kiskisik, it was an elegy, a song of endings. He was now a character in their story, a footnote in the grand tale of the Iron Serpent. He had the food that would keep his family alive for another week. He had the promise of more. But as he turned his back on the camp and began the long walk home, the lying wind felt colder than ever before, and the only thing he could remember was the look in his father's eyes, a look of sorrow and of shame. Chapter 2. The Surveyor's Chain. Returning to the surveyor's camp was like entering a foreign country. The rations he had brought home had been received with a heavy silence by his family. The gratitude in their eyes was mingled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. His father had looked at the salted pork and white flour, the food of the white man, and then at Kiskisik, and had simply said, "The path you walk is a new one. May it not lead you off a cliff." And now, standing beside Thomas Cartwright, as the morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie, Kiskisik felt the truth of those words. His world had been one of circles, the circle of the seasons, the circle of life and death, the circular camps of his people. This new world was one of lines. It began with the surveyor's chain. Thomas, oblivious to the turmoil in his guide's heart, was alight with purpose. "This is the life, Kiskisik," he said, his breath pluming in the cool air. To be the first to map this land, to draw the future with a line of steel. It's magnificent. He was holding his transit, the brass and glass instrument Kiskisik had first seen him with. To Kiskisik, it looked like a strange, malevolent eye, one that flattened the world, reducing the sacred hills and valleys to mere numbers and angles. Their task for the day was to plot a straight line west, directly toward a low rise that Kiskisik knew as the Sleeping Buffalo, a place where his ancestors had performed ceremonies for a successful hunt. Harrison, the chief surveyor, had pointed to it on his map, a featureless bump on a sheet of paper. "We go through it," he had ordered. The railway does not go around. Kiskisik's role was to scout ahead, to find the easiest path for the men who followed, the ones who carried the heavy wooden stakes and the surveyor's chain. It was a long, heavy chain made of 100 iron links, a tool for imposing a rigid, unyielding geometry on the flowing, living land. Two men, whom Thomas called chainmen, would stretch it out, marking the end with a pin, and then repeat the process, their progress a relentless, mechanical crawl across the prairie. "The ground is softer to the south," Kiskisik said, his voice quiet. "The path is easier there. It will save your men work." He was testing him, offering a path that would lead them around the base of the sacred rise, not over it. Thomas consulted his compass, then squinted through the eye of his transit. "But it is not straight," he said, a hint of confusion in his voice. "The line must be straight. A straight line is the most efficient." "It is the principle of modern engineering. The land is not straight," Kiskisik replied, gesturing to the rolling plains. "It has a spirit. A river follows the path of least resistance. A buffalo herd follows the grass. They do not travel in straight lines. They follow the spirit of the land." Thomas smiled, a friendly, condescending smile that made Kiskisik's jaw tighten. "That's a beautiful way of thinking, Kiskisik. The poetry of your people is remarkable, but poetry doesn't build a railway. The iron horse, as you call it, does not follow the spirit of the land. It makes the land submit to its own spirit, the spirit of progress, the spirit of progress." Kiskisik had seen what that spirit left in its wake, the rotting carcasses of 1,000 buffalo, left to fester under the sun after their hides had been taken, the deep, ugly scars in the earth, the whiskey traders who preyed on the despair of his people. He said nothing, but a cold anger settled in his heart. He had made his bargain. He would do his job, but he would do it his way. He began to lead them, but not on the straight path Harrison had decreed. He led them on a path that was almost straight, a path that a man with a map and a compass would not question. But it was a path that skirted the ancient wallows, that avoided the patch of rare medicinal herbs his grandmother cherished, that gave a wide berth to a nesting ground for prairie falcons. To Thomas and his chainmen, sweating under the prairie sun, it seemed a direct route. Only Kiskisik knew the subtle detours he was making, the small acts of preservation he was committing in secret. As they worked, Thomas, with his insatiable curiosity, was a constant presence at Kiskisik's side. He asked about everything, the names of the plants, the habits of the gophers, the meaning of the Cree words for the clouds and the wind. Kiskisik, who had expected only arrogance, found himself slowly, cautiously answering him. There was an innocence to Thomas's questions, a genuine desire to understand that was different from the cold, utilitarian questioning of Harrison. "Why do you call that rise the Sleeping Buffalo?" Thomas asked as they stopped for their midday meal, pointing toward the sacred hill. "Because the Great Spirit shaped it to remind us of where our life comes from," Kiskisik explained. "In the time before my grandfather's grandfather, a great hunter followed a white buffalo to that hill. The buffalo lay down to rest and gave itself to the hunter, so the people would not starve. Its spirit still sleeps there to ensure the herds will always return." Thomas listened, his expression thoughtful. "A lovely story, a myth to explain the geological formation. It's fascinating how your people weave stories into the landscape." "It is not a story," Kiskisik said, his voice sharp. "It is a memory. The land has a memory just as a man does." Thomas looked at him, his brow furrowed not in disagreement, but in concentration, as if trying to grasp a concept that was utterly alien to him. "A memory," he repeated softly. What a strange idea! In that moment, Kiskisik understood the vast, seemingly unbridgeable gulf that lay between them. Thomas was not a bad man. He was simply a man from a world that had forgotten that the land could have a spirit, a memory. He was a man who believed in the power of straight lines, of numbers, of the cold, hard logic of his instruments. He saw the world as a thing to be acted upon, to be improved. As they packed up to continue their relentless march, Kiskisik looked at the line of freshly driven stakes that now scarred the prairie, pointing directly at the heart of the sleeping buffalo. He had managed to save a few herbs and a bird's nest, but he could not change the path of the Iron Serpent itself. He was caught in the current of this new world, a world that saw his people's most sacred memories as mere poetry, and their home as an obstacle to be overcome. He had formed a strange, almost friendship with the young man who was, in his own innocent way, helping to destroy everything he had ever loved. The path he walked was indeed a new one, and he was beginning to understand that it led not to a cliff, but to a place far more treacherous, the land between. Chapter 3, The Iron Horse. The weeks that followed settled into a strange rhythm. The work of surveying was slow, meticulous, and, for Kiskisik, deeply painful. Each day he led the men with their chains and instruments deeper into his people's lands, leaving a trail of wooden stakes that felt like wounds in the earth. Yet a fragile bond had formed between him and Thomas Cartwright. The young surveyor, with his endless questions and genuine fascination with Cree culture, had become a complicated presence in Kiskisik's life. He would share his midday meal with Kiskisik, listening intently to the old stories, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tried to understand a world so different from his own. "It's the story of our people," Kiskisik tried to explain one afternoon as they sat in the shadow of a granite outcrop. "The land is the story. To drive a stake into it is to stop its heart. To plow it is to tear its skin." Thomas, ever the pragmatist, would counter. "But it's also just soil, Kiskisik. Rich soil that could grow wheat and feed thousands. The railway will bring farmers families. It will bring a new kind of life. You can't stop progress." Kiskisik would fall silent, the gulf between them too wide to bridge with words. He was beginning to see that Thomas was not cruel. He was simply blind. He looked at the land and saw potential for the future. Kiskisik looked at it and saw the sacred memories of the past. The friendship that grew between them was a strange, delicate plant, growing in the poisoned soil of a dying world. The true nature of that poison was revealed with the arrival of the grading crews. The surveyors were the scouts of the new world, but the graders were its shock troops. They followed the line of stakes with their heavy plows and scrapers, drawn by teams of mules and horses, tearing a wide, raw scar across the prairie. The sacred rise of the sleeping buffalo, which Kiskisik had so carefully guided them toward, was not spared. Harrison's orders were absolute. The plows came, and in a single afternoon of roaring men and cracking whips, the hill was cut in two, its gentle, sleeping shape disemboweled, the sacred memory buried under a pile of raw earth. Kiskisik watched from a distance, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw Thomas standing with the grading foreman, pointing at a set of blueprints. There was no malice on his face, only the focused satisfaction of a man whose calculations were being proven correct. He had seen the hill as a number on a page, an obstacle to be overcome. He was utterly unaware that he was standing on desecrated ground. The graders were followed by the track, layers, and with them came the iron horse itself. The first time Kiskisik saw it, it was a terrifying spectacle. It was a living beast of black iron, breathing smoke and steam, its single eye a glaring lantern. It moved with a thunderous, rhythmic roar, a sound that shook the earth and sent a primal fear through him. It was a force of nature that was entirely unnatural. It was the screaming metal beast from the Elder's darkest prophecies made real. The train brought more than just rails and ties. It brought men in fine coats from the east, men with faces soft from city life and eyes hungry for spectacle. They carried powerful new rifles, and they came for one reason, to hunt the last of the buffalo. One morning, a frantic rider from his own camp found him. A small herd, perhaps 200 strong, more buffalo than had been seen in this territory for over a year, had been spotted moving south, seeking refuge in the sheltered valleys near the Cypress Hills. They were a miracle, a sign from the Great Spirit that the life of the people was not yet over. They were hope made manifest in flesh and bone. But the news had also reached the railway. The next day the iron horse chugged to a halt, and the men from the east disembarked, their rifles gleaming. They were not hunters, they were killers. They did not stalk their prey with respect. They set up their long-range rifles on tripods and began to fire into the herd from the comfort of the railway line. It was not a hunt, it was a massacre. Kiskisik stood on a ridge, watching in horror. The sound of the powerful rifles echoed across the prairie, a relentless, deafening barrage. The buffalo, confused and terrified, ran in circles, their bellows of pain and fear a heartbreaking chorus. They fell, one after another, until the valley floor was littered with their dark, still forms. The men from the east cheered and slapped each other on the back, as if they had accomplished a great feat of arms. He saw Thomas among them. He was not shooting, but he was watching, his face alight with a kind of morbid excitement. He was a spectator at the death of a world. When the shooting finally stopped, Kiskisik walked down into the valley of death. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. The men were moving among the carcasses, not taking meat for their families or hides for their lodges, but using saws to hack off the heads as trophies, leaving the rest of the sacred animal to rot. He found Thomas standing over the body of a great bull, its magnificent head already severed, its eyes staring, vacant, at the empty sky. "Isn't it incredible, Kiskisik?" Thomas said, his voice buzzing with the thrill of the slaughter. "The power of these rifles, to wipe out a whole herd in an afternoon. It's progress, progress." The word struck Kiskisik with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Thomas's excited face, at the field of rotting carcasses, at the severed head of the great bull, and the fragile, complicated bond between them shattered into 1,000 pieces. This was not blindness. This was a fundamental sickness of the soul. These people did not just conquer. They destroyed, and they called it progress. They celebrated waste. They reveled in death. "You have taken our future," Kiskisik said, his voice a low, shaking whisper. "You have taken it, and you have left it to rot in the sun." Thomas's smile faltered. For the first time he seemed to see the horror of the scene through Kiskisik's eyes. He looked at the carnage at the waist, and a flicker of shame, of understanding, crossed his face. "A Kiskisik I didn't think, but it was too late." Kiskisik turned his back on him. He turned his back on the iron horse, on the men with their bloody saws, on the money and the rations. He walked away from the valley of death, his heart a cold, hard knot of grief and rage. He had been a traitor to his people, a guide to his own destruction, for nothing. He had believed he could be a bridge, that he could mitigate the damage, that he could find a path between two worlds, but he saw now that there was no path. There was only a choice, and as the sound of the cheering men faded behind him, he knew he had made the wrong one. Chapter 4, The Choice. Walking away from the valley of slaughter was both an end and a beginning. Kiskisik returned to his people, not as a provider, but as a penitent. The last of the flour and salt pork he had earned was long gone, and the hunger he had tried to hold at bay had returned with a vengeance, sharpened by the grief of the massacre. He had walked a path between two worlds, and now he belonged to neither. His homecoming was met not with anger, but with a profound and heavy silence that was far worse. His father, his face etched with a deep sorrow, simply nodded, the look in his eyes saying what words did not need to. You see now. The other men of the camp, men he had hunted with since he was a boy, would not meet his gaze. The children, who once flocked to hear his stories, now fell silent and scattered when he approached. He was a ghost in his own village, haunted by the scent of blood and the echo of the white man's rifles. He had seen the face of progress, and it was the face of a grinning skull. His brief, complicated friendship with Thomas Cartwright felt like a fever dream, a foolish dalliance with an impossible idea. There could be no understanding, no middle ground. The Iron Serpent did not negotiate, it consumed, and he, Kiskisik, had been its guide. The shame of it was a physical weight, a constant ache in his chest. As the days grew shorter and the bite of the coming winter sharpened, a new spirit began to stir among the scattered and starving bands of Cree and Métis. It was a spirit of anger, born of broken treaties and empty bellies. Riders came and went from their camp in the dead of night, their horses lathered, their faces grim. They spoke of a man to the north, a leader who had returned from exile, a man named Real. They spoke of another man, a Cree war chief named Pitaquahenapiwi, or Poundmaker, who was gathering the angry and the desperate, arguing that if the crown would not honor its promises, then the people had to stand together. The whispers of resistance were a fire on the wind. They spoke of fighting back, of derailing the Iron Serpent, of driving the white man from the land. The younger warriors in Kiskisik's camp listened with a desperate hope in their eyes. They were tired of watching their families starve. They were ready for a war. The elders, including Kiskisik's own father, cautioned patience, their words full of the hard, won, bitter wisdom of men who knew the true cost of fighting a war they could not win. Kiskisik found himself caught in the middle. His experience with the surveyors had shown him the overwhelming power and resources of the white man. He knew that a direct fight would be suicide, but the fire of resistance called to the rage in his own heart. The image of the rotting buffalo, of Thomas's excited face, was a constant torment. He had stood by and done nothing. The thought of action, any action, was a powerful lure. His unique position, however, made him an object of suspicion to both sides. To the peace-seeking elders, he was the boy who had taken the white man's money, who had guided the enemy. To the young warriors, he was a coward who had worked for the railway instead of fighting it. He was isolated, his knowledge a burden he could not share. The moment of choice arrived with a party of warriors from Poundmaker's camp. They were led by a tall, fierce man named Wandering Spirit. His face was painted for war, and his eyes held a burning intensity. They came not to recruit, but to demand. They had a plan to attack the railway, to sever the iron artery that was bringing soldiers and settlers into the territory. They wanted to tear up the tracks, to burn the trestle bridges. To do that, they needed information. You, a Wandering Spirit said, his voice sharp as he singled out Kiskisik in the center of the camp. You walked with them. You know their ways. You know their schedules. You know where they are weak. It was not a request. It was a challenge, delivered in front of his entire community. Kiskisik's father stepped forward. My son made a mistake, he said, his voice heavy. He has. Carried the shame of it, but this path you walk, Wandering Spirit, is a path of death. The soldiers that will come on that railway will outnumber us 10-1. It is a war we cannot win. And the path you walk is a path of slow starvation, Wandering Spirit retorted, his gaze sweeping over the gaunt faces of the villagers. To die on your feet is better than to die on your knees. I ask your son. Will you use the knowledge you bought with your honor to help your people, or will you hoard it like a coward and watch us all perish? Every eye was on Kiskisik. The silence was absolute. He looked at his father's weary, pleading face. He looked at the fiery defiance in Wandering Spirit's eyes. He thought of the rotting buffalo, a monument to the white man's waste. He thought of Thomas Cartwright, the friendly, smiling face of destruction. He had tried to be a peacemaker, a bridge, but the bridge had been burned, and the chasm between the two worlds was too wide. He had been a scout for the destroyers. Now he would be a scout for the resistance. He would use the knowledge he had gained not to build their world, but to defend his own. He would teach the warriors how to read the surveyor's maps, how to predict the supply train schedules, how to find the weakest points in the trestle bridges that span the coulees. He would turn their own logic, their own straight lines, against them. He met wandering spirit's gaze, his own eyes now as hard and clear as flint. "I will not watch my people perish," Kiskisik said, his voice ringing with a newfound purpose. "Tell me your plan. I will show you where the Iron Serpent is most vulnerable. I will show you where to strike." A murmur of approval went through the young warriors. His father closed his eyes, a look of profound grief on his face. He was proud of his son's courage, but he knew with the terrible certainty of an elder that this choice, however honorable, was the beginning of the end. Kiskisik had finally chosen a side. He had chosen to fight, and in the vast, unforgiving prairies of 1885, that choice was a death sentence. Chapter 5, Whispers on the Wire. Joining Wandering Spirit's war camp was like stepping into the heart of a storm. The camp was nestled in the rugged, wooded country north of the Saskatchewan River, a place of sharp ridges and deep coulees, a landscape suited for hiding and for fighting. Unlike the quiet, desperate sorrow of his own village, the air here was electric with a furious energy. It was a camp of young men, their faces lean with hunger but their eyes burning with the fire of defiance. They were the dispossessed, the angry, the ones who had nothing left to lose. Wandering Spirit welcomed Kiskisik not as a brother, but as a weapon. "You have the knowledge," the war chief said, his voice hard. "Now you will teach us how to use it. We will be the ghost that haunts the iron road. We will make the white man fear the prairie." Kiskisik's first task was to change the way the warriors thought. Their way was the way of the raid, a swift, direct assault on an enemy. They thought in terms of horses and rifles, of courage and strength. Kiskisik had to teach them to think like a surveyor, to see the world in terms of lines, schedules, and vulnerabilities. He drew a map in the dirt, a copy of one of Harrison's survey maps he had memorized. He showed them the straight, rigid line of the railway, a stark contrast to the flowing, natural lines of the rivers and hills. "This is their mind," Kiskisik explained, tracing the surveyor's line. "It is straight. It is predictable. They do not see the land as we do. They see it as a series of obstacles between 2 points. Their strength is their weakness. Because they think in straight lines, they are easy to intercept." He began to teach them the rhythm of the railway. He knew, from his time in the camp, that the supply trains ran on a schedule. A train carrying food and tools would come every 3 days, a train carrying rails. And ties would come once a week, and once a month a train with a red, painted car would arrive, carrying the wages for the workers. To attack a train of rails is to annoy them, Kiskisik said. To attack the train with the red car is to wound them. But his most important lesson was about a new and mysterious power the white man possessed. Along the railway line, tall poles had been erected, connected by a single, thin strand of iron wire. Kiskisik had watched the railway men use it, tapping a small machine that sent clicking sounds down the wire. He had spoken to Thomas about it, and the young surveyor had explained it with great excitement. "It is the telegraph," Thomas had said, "a whispering wire. It allows a man in Winnipeg to speak to a man here in an instant. It is how they send orders, how they call for help. It is the nerve system of the Iron Serpent." Kiskisik now understood the strategic importance of this whispering wire. It was not just a curiosity, it was the railway's greatest vulnerability. "The warriors want to tear up the track," he told Wandering Spirit, "and we will. But first, we must cut the whispering wire. The railway is a great beast, but if you cut its nerves, it becomes deaf and blind. It cannot call for help. It cannot warn the next station of an attack. The wire is the first thing we must strike." Wandering Spirit, a man of action, saw the wisdom in this. A plan was formed. It was a plan born of Kiskisik's cold logic and the warriors' intimate knowledge of the land. They would not attack a fortified station. They would strike in the empty spaces between, at a place where the railway line ran through a narrow cut, with steep banks on either side, a place Kiskisik himself had scouted for the surveyors months before. It was a natural trap. The night of the attack was moonless, the prairie a vast sea of darkness. The war party moved like shadows, their horses' hooves muffled. They reached the cut and split into 2 groups. The first, a small party of the quietest and most agile warriors, scaled the telegraph poles on either side of the cut, and with heavy axes severed the whispering wire. The nerve was cut. The beast was blinded. The second, larger group, under Kiskisik's direction, set to work on the track itself. This was his most terrible and useful knowledge. He had watched the track, layers, had understood the simple genius of their method. The rails were held to the wooden ties by heavy iron spikes. With pry bars and hammers, the warriors began to work, not to tear up the track, but to loosen a single rail on the curve entering the cut. It was slow, arduous work, the clang of their hammers muffled by blankets. As dawn approached, they heard it in the distance, the rhythmic chuffing of the iron horse. It was the weekly supply train, heavy with tools, food, and, most importantly, ammunition. Kiskisik felt a cold knot of dread and exhilaration in his stomach. This was the moment of truth. His knowledge, his betrayal, his choice, it had all led to this. The train entered the curve, its speed unwavering. The engineer, comfortable in his routine, would have no reason to suspect danger. As the massive iron engine hit the loosened rail, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The rail buckled. The engine, with its immense weight and momentum, leaped from the track, tearing up the ties, and plowed nose, first into the earthen bank of the cut, with a deafening screech of tortured metal. The cars behind it, unable to stop, slammed into each other, telescoping in a chaotic pile of splintered wood and twisted iron. For a moment there was only a stunned silence, broken by the hissing of steam from the dying engine. Then Wandering Spirit let out a triumphant war cry, and the warriors swarmed down into the cut. The train crew, dazed and terrified, surrendered without a fight. The warriors descended on the freight cars, not with the wild abandon of a raid, but with a disciplined purpose. They took the crates of rifles and ammunition, the bags of flour, the barrels of salted meat. They took what they needed to survive, to fight another day. They left the rest. Kiskisik stood on the ridge, watching the organized chaos below. He felt no joy, no triumph. He felt only a grim, cold satisfaction. He had used the white man's logic against them. He had turned their straight line into a fatal weakness. He had wounded the Iron Serpent. As he looked at the wreckage, at the plume of black smoke rising into the pristine morning sky, he knew this was only the beginning. The whispers on the wire were silent for now, but they would return, and when they did, they would be screaming for revenge. The war had truly begun. Chapter 6, The Echo of the Guns. The raid was a stunning success, and its effects rippled through the resistance camps like a prairie fire. The captured rifles and ammunition gave them teeth. The food and supplies gave them strength. But more than that, the victory gave them hope. For the first time, it felt as though they were not simply raging against an unstoppable force, but that they could fight back, that they could be strategic, that they could win. Wandering Spirit's war camp swelled with new warriors, drawn by the news of the victory. Kiskisik, the quiet scout, was now regarded as a master tactician, his name spoken with a new respect. But amidst the celebration, Kiskisik felt a growing unease. He had not just derailed a train, he had poked the hornet's nest. He knew the mind of the white man, the relentless, methodical logic that drove them. They would see this not as a simple raid, but as a calculated, strategic attack. They would understand that the severing of the telegraph wire was the act of an intelligent enemy. And they would respond not with a disorganized posse, but with a disciplined, overwhelming force. They will send the red coats, he warned Wandering Spirit as the warriors celebrated around a large bonfire, the North-West Mounted Police. They are not like the railway men. They are trained soldiers. They are relentless. Wandering Spirit, flush with victory, dismissed his concerns. Let them come, the war chief declared, raising a captured rifle. We have their own guns now. We will meet them on the field of battle like warriors. Kiskisik knew a direct confrontation would be a massacre. The mounted police were not just soldiers. They were the embodiment of the Crown's authority, and they would be relentless in their pursuit of justice. His fears were realized a week later. A scout perched on a high ridge brought the news. A column of red coats, 50 strong, was moving steadily across the prairie, their scarlet tunics a stark, bloody line against the brown grass. They were not moving toward the site of the derailment. They were moving toward the cluster of resistance camps. They were not investigating a crime, they were hunting the criminals. Panic began to replace the bravado in the camp. 50 trained soldiers, armed with repeating rifles, was a force unlike any they had ever faced. The warriors looked to Wandering Spirit, who now, for the first time, seemed uncertain. His way was the way of the direct charge, a test of courage. But how could you charge an enemy who could kill you from a distance before you were even within arrow, shot? All eyes turned to Kiskisik. He had predicted this. He had understood the enemy. He climbed a small rise and looked out at the assembled warriors, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. He had to make them understand, to change their thinking from that of a raid to that of a war. "We will not fight them in the open," Kiskisik said, his voice clear and steady, carrying over the anxious crowd. "That is their way, not ours. We will not give them a battle. We will give them a ghost. We will show them that this land has a spirit, and it is on our side." He laid out a daring plan. The war camp would be abandoned. The women, children, and elders would retreat to a secret, sheltered valley deep in the hills. The warriors would not meet the redcoats head on. Instead, they would use the broken, rugged country to their advantage. They would become invisible. As the column of mounted police advanced, they found a landscape that was unnervingly empty. The camps they had been sent to pacify were deserted, the campfires cold. They were marching into a void. The commander of the troop, a veteran officer named Major Crozier, grew increasingly wary. His scouts could find no sign of the enemy, yet he could feel hundreds of eyes on them from the surrounding hills. The confrontation came at a place Kiskisik had chosen, a wide, shallow river crossing. As the police began to ford the river, a single shot echoed from the bluffs upstream. It was not aimed at a man, but at a large boulder perched precariously on the cliff edge, loosened by the spring thaw. The bullet struck the rock, and with a deep groan, the boulder tumbled down, crashing into the river and sending a massive wave of water and mud surging downstream. It was not an attack, but a message, a demonstration of power and precision. Then, from the bluffs on both sides of the river, the warriors appeared. They did not charge. They simply stood, silent and menacing, their captured rifles glinting in the sun. There were hundreds of them, appearing as if from the earth itself. The redcoats were caught, exposed, in the middle of the river. They were surrounded, not by a disorganized mob, but by a disciplined force that controlled the high ground. Major Crozier, a man who understood the language of power, knew he was in an unwinnable position. A battle here would mean the annihilation of his troop. He raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. Across the river, Wandering Spirit, flanked by Kiskisik, watched. There was no war cry, no challenge. There was only a cold, hard stare, a statement of intent. This was not a battle for land, but a negotiation of power. Kiskisik had shown the Crown that the resistance was not a band of renegades. They were an organized force with a skilled tactician. They could strike where they chose. They could disappear when they chose. The Prairie was their ally. After a long, tense standoff, Major Crozier made his decision. He gave the order for his troop to slowly, carefully withdraw. It was not a retreat. It was a tactical concession. He had come to dispense justice and had found himself outmaneuvered. As the red coats disappeared back across the prairie, the warriors on the bluffs let out a great, triumphant roar. They had faced the best soldiers the white man could send, and they had made them turn back. Kiskisik, however, felt no triumph. He watched the scarlet column retreat, and he knew this was only a temporary victory. He had won the engagement, but the war was far from over. The echo of that single, warning gunshot would be heard all the way to the capital. The response, when it came, would not be a troop of 50 men. It would be an army. He had shown the white man that his people could fight with intelligence and strategy, and in doing so, he had ensured that the war to come would be a long, brutal, and unforgiving one. He had solidified his place as a leader, but he had also sealed the fate of his people. The echo of the guns would now be a permanent feature of the prairie wind. Epilogue: the war, when it came in full, was as swift and brutal as Kiskisik had feared. The Canadian government, using the very railway he had helped to map, transported thousands of soldiers onto the prairie in a matter of weeks. The scattered victories of the resistance were no match for the overwhelming force of a modern army. The battles of Fish Creek, Cut Knife, and Batoche were fought with courage and desperation, but the outcome was never in doubt. The rebellion was crushed. Wandering Spirit died at the Battle of Batoche, leading a charge against a Gatling gun, his warrior's heart finally silenced by the relentless machinery of the New World. Poundmaker and Reel surrendered, to be tried for treason. The resistance was broken, its leaders dead or in chains. Kiskisik did not die in battle. He was captured months later, living with the starving remnants of his band in the Cypress Hills. He was too valuable to be hanged. His knowledge of the railway, the very thing that had made him a threat, now made him a useful asset for the crown. He was given a choice, a long prison sentence, or to serve as a scout for the mounted police, helping them to pacify the last pockets of resistance and to map the territory for the coming flood of settlers. And so his journey came full circle. He once again found himself guiding the forces of the New World, but this time the choice was not his own. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, weary emptiness. He did his job with a quiet efficiency, his face an unreadable mask. He was a ghost, a man moving through a world that was no longer his heart a barren landscape of loss. One day, years later, his patrol was overseeing a new settlement being built beside the now completed railway line. A train pulled into the station, and from it disembarked a man in a fine suit, his hair now thinning and streaked with gray. He was the chief engineer for the region. He saw Kiskisik standing by his horse, and his face broke into a smile of recognition. It was Thomas Cartwright. "Kiskisik, my God, it's you." Thomas approached, his hand outstretched. "I heard you were involved in that unfortunate business. I'm glad to see you made it through. It was a sad affair, but necessary. Look at this now." He gestured to the town, with its church steeple and neat grid of streets, to the fields of wheat that stretched to the horizon. "This is what we were building. This is progress. You see that now, don't you?" Kiskisik looked at Thomas, at his earnest, smiling face. He looked at the town, at the steel rails that gleamed under the prairie sun, at the endless, straight lines of the fences that carved the land into squares. He thought of the sleeping buffalo, now just a memory under a bed of steel. He thought of the valley of the dead buffalo, now a field of wheat. He thought of Wandering Spirit, his body broken by a machine gun. He looked at the man who had once been his friend, a man who could look at the graveyard of a world and call it progress. He did not take Thomas's hand. He did not speak. He simply turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, a silent, solitary figure moving across a landscape that no longer remembered his name. The Iron Serpent had won. It had devoured the circles, and the world was now made of straight lines.